The Trump administration has proposed a new rule that would prevent a majority of migrants from claiming political asylum in the United States. The move, which follows the beginning of immigration raids over the weekend, would require asylum seekers to make their first claims in other countries.
According to officials, roughly 2,000 undocumented immigrants are being targeted. In response to these raids, multiple organizations have launched the United Sanctuaries of America campaign as a call to action for faith-based communities and grassroots groups. Joining us to discuss the campaign and the ongoing ICE raids is CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Krish Vignarajah. She previously served as policy director to Michelle Obama. Great to see you again, Krish.
Thanks for having me.
Talk about the raids have not sort of materialized fully yet, but what have you and your group been planning for?
Yeah, so the campaign is really to provide protection to the folks who are most vulnerable and targeted by these raids. The effort is a faith-based effort, for sure, in the sense that the sanctuaries are provided by churches and religious centers, but supported by community-based organizations from across the nation, like LULAC, Hispanic Heritage Foundation, Mary Center, and the goal is to really provide all of the services and community efforts required to kind of undertake what we're expecting to have to handle, which is mass deportations, as was announced a few weeks ago.
Well, all the ICE people that we've spoken to say ICE straight up just does not have the capacity for mass deportations. And as far as 2,000, I mean, 2,000 crossed the border in a day, as far as I know. And so I think the real question here is about detention and then the facilities. And one thing, I mean, as a person who's involved in the faith-based initiative here, has there been any effort to step up, the churches or sanctuaries in Mexico where migrants could stay before they legally present at a port of entry?
Yeah, so we work with churches, not just in Mexico and the Northern Triangle. Look, everyone is trying to do their part, but the reality is when you have governments crumbling, gang violence, people who are extorted, targeted, raped, killed, that's the conditions of these countries. And so yes, there is the piece that faith-based groups can play, pastors, priests that we work with, but the reality is that the conditions that people are fleeing from, when a mother undertakes a 1,000-mile perilous journey with a baby, there's a reason they're doing it. It's not just because they want to come here for McDonald's. And I just think that that's where knowing that it has to be, a comprehensive response, I think is critical.
One of the things that we have learned more about is just the conditions at these detention centers that all migrants are facing, including women and children, the overcrowding that is going on there. And what we're hearing is that there are just so many people coming across that the system is overwhelmed and this is the best that we can do. What's the reality there?
Yeah, so I think first we have to contextualize it, right? The reality is that this is not kind of historic proportions that we've never experienced before. In 2000, we had 1.6 million migrants coming across the border.
Right, but just to jump in here, that was because many of them were single Mexican males who could immediately be repatriated over to Mexico. In this particular case, even if the number is 1 million, all of them have to be cared for and detained for several months, if not years, kept in the United States while they await their asylum process.
Yeah, so let's be clear. It wasn't 1.6 million single males that came.
Right,
we certainly had families, we had unaccompanied minors at that time too. The kind of element I think that you're suggesting in terms of are we equipped for the new dynamic of what we're seeing, the answer is absolutely not.
Yes.
But this has been a storm and crisis in the making. If you take January, for example, right, nearly 6 months ago, we had the facilities for 3,000 families and children. We had 28,000 families and children coming across. Right. The response has been to finance places like Homestead, largest children's detention facility in the country. I visited a couple months ago.
Private for-profit.
Exactly. We're paying $775 per person, per child, for a child to stay there. When I visited there versus just a Catholic charity run down the street, the time that a child stays in Homestead was 58 days at the time I visited, compared to one of our smaller community-based centers, 30 days. There's a reason why children are remaining in these larger facilities for a longer time. there's a profit incentive. And so our response has always been that faith-based organizations like Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service provide a solution that is better for the children and better for taxpayers because we do it at a third of the cost.
But isn't there HHS regulations involved? Because that's what all this comes down to, which is that you need to be certified by the Office of Refugee and Resettlement within the Health and Human Services. And so, I mean, I don't even know what the law says about this. Are we allowed to funnel dollars to faith-based organizations?
And we do.
Yeah, okay.
So we actually provide what's called transitional foster care. The goal is really to provide a setting that is as close to what a child would experience in any other situation. Obviously, you can't do that for every single child in the most immediate sense. But what groups like mine have been doing has been to grow that kind of programming as well as what we call community-based care, which means that rather than putting them in a facility that has 2,000 children, that we can put them into small homes that are about kind of a group home of 8 beds or kind of if you're veering towards the higher end, 20 beds. And that's where we believe that we have an alternative. And what we've been doing is scaling it across the country. And that's kind of our message is when we're up against a company like Caliburn, right? General Kelly just joined the board. I don't have a 7-figure, financing that I can put into a lobbying arm.
Right.
But our message is that we have provided these kinds of solutions for decades, and we're stepping up our efforts. All we need is to get the government support so we can provide more opportunities for these children.
And what has the administration response, if any, been to your group and your approach?
Well, I mean, one of the responses has been, and this is really because it's the talking points of some of these for-profit prison companies and the other for-profit companies, has been, well, no, you can't turn to the faith-based groups because they can't do it at the scale that we can. And our response is, look, it's going to take more effort for us to cobble together these smaller community bed solutions, but we've been doing it. Are we at the point where I would like us to be at this moment? No. But we have, in May, we submitted a few proposals for facilities in a couple locations across the country. We're about to submit additional solutions so that we can provide that scale. But the reality is that, some of the agencies are more comfortable with, GEO or Civic Corps, or just the companies that they've been operating with.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is bureaucratic bloat, and it's also just an obsession here in DC and the media right now, which is about the downstream. It's like, how do we deal with it now that it's here? There's no discussion about stopping this in the first place, about changes to law, the courts, we talk about it here all the time, which is, and then, I mean, in your particular case, I'm going to assume you're mostly a company for unaccompanied minor children, which is a whole other problem in and of itself. I mean, when you have a parent who puts a 6-year-old on a train and ships it to the United States, I mean, what do we do with these children? We have tens of thousands of them now in these facilities. What's your group looking at in terms of doing that?
I mean, and so that's where the transitional foster care is the most important because with a child of that tender age, right, you can't put them into a larger facility. But the second thing I should mention is that we do obviously focus on unaccompanied minors, but we also focus on what we call family case management. And so we should be clear that when we're talking about detention facilities, again, there is an alternative. So we piloted something called the Family Case Management Program. And what we were again able to show is that we are as effective in terms of compliance with immigration law. 99.7 and 99.8% of these individuals show up for their ICE initial meeting as well as their immigration hearing. We do it obviously at a fraction of the cost of some of these large bed facilities, but we're also able to provide that alternative to detention that we can scale. And so our answer is we shouldn't be claiming that on the soil of America we can't provide toothbrushes or potable water to people. What we should finance is the solutions that are actually better for the individuals, less costly for taxpayers, but also are compliant with U.S. federal law.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer to me in order to turn them over to a faith-based organization here.
Share with us some of the stories that you're hearing from migrants of why they're choosing to make this incredibly difficult, incredibly dangerous journey, often with small children.
Yeah, so one of the a small family that I met with in Arizona, it was a son, a daughter, and a mother. And what had happened was the Father and the son were coming home from the market. They had been attacked by a gang. Initially, they would just ask for their money. When they handed over the money, then the gang also asked for the goods that were on their cart. The father tried to protect the cart as they pulled out machetes, said to his son, run. His son did run, went home, brought back a few of the neighbors. When he returned, his father was dead. The cart was gone, and him and his mother and daughter and sister immediately fled. Those are the kinds of conditions of people that we're talking about.
And is someone like that eligible for asylum?
Yes.
What does the law say?
Yeah, I mean, so as long as we can.
Well, it depends, right?
Well, so the initial threshold is that they have to meet a credible fear. 88% of people are able
that's
to make
to present
that
for asylum.
Right,
that doesn't
exactly.
mean you're going to get asylum.
And that's to say, I mean, and it's not like you want to come to this country, great, come on in. It is actually, you need to explain the circumstances that you were fleeing from. There has to be a credible, I mean, right, it's not just a fear that you express, it has to be viewed as a credible threat. And then that individual, especially if it is, a threat of persecution, violence, that individual can then seek asylum. Obviously, in the last 24 hours, we're hearing news of changes so that there's supposed to be an interim final rule announced today, which would basically say that if you arrive to the U.S. and come through any third country, that you are no longer allowed to seek asylum in the U.S. The issue with that is kind of a fewfold. First, you can't have a regulation that only applies to the southern border, as this rule would have.
Well, it would apply to Canada, too.
Well, we have an agreement with Canada.
Yeah.
But obviously, the conditions in Canada are very different than the conditions in Mexico, in Guatemala, in any of the countries in transit. And that's why, under U.S. code right now, there is actually a requirement where you need to show that basically it is a safe third country, and that there's actually a system that is functioning that could serve to provide asylum. There's been no showing that any of those conditions have even been reviewed, let alone met, when we're talking about the countries that we're discussing in the southern border. The second part of that is that there is a very clear firm resettlement rule, meaning that if you are able and have been to seek asylum in a third country, if you've been given any indication that there is such an opportunity, under U.S. law already, you are barred from seeking asylum in the U.S. And so our point is, look, there is a humanitarian crisis, but it is one that has been man-made because we have not been prepared for what has been the situation of the last several months. And we haven't been putting the resources into the legal system knowing that we do have a backlog. I think, right. And that's where I just think that we need to have an honest conversation about the bipartisan solutions that we need to put in place, because of course no one wants to have $1 million backlog. No one wants to have open borders, and no one really, I think, except for maybe a few folks who've been, saying some of this kind of vitriolic political rhetoric, wants closed borders. That's just not who this country is. And that's where I just think that we need to have an honest conversation about what are the problems and how do we institute solutions.
Yeah, we talk about the core to the backlog and how important that is here a lot. Krish, thank you so much. It's always great to have you.
Thank you for the work.
Appreciate it. Next on Rising, when it comes to federal labor laws, housekeepers, nannies, and caregivers have largely actually been excluded. But new legislation aims at making them part of the conversation and protecting them from discrimination.
Coming up, we're going to sit down with the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which represents roughly 2 million workers, and the group's involvement in the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights Act, how that bill could help level the playing field. That when Rising returns.